The rain had been falling for hours, a constant, heavy downpour that seemed determined to wash the world clean. Streets that once held memories of laughter and busy chatter now looked like rivers, swollen and dark, reflecting the muted glow of streetlights. The wind whipped against the old windows of Miriam Hart's cottage, rattling them like a reminder of all the years she had spent fighting the storms of her own life. The house, tucked away on the outskirts of town, stood alone, a solitary figure against the raging elements outside. Inside, the storm's fury could still be heard, but it had become something of a backdrop to Miriam's daily existence, no longer jarring but instead expected, like the distant hum of a tune you can't quite remember. Miriam moved slowly, the familiar ache in her left leg pulling with each step. It had been years since the injury, but the pain still crept up on her, reminding her of a time when things had been different, when she had dreams and hope. Now, there was nothing left but the quiet, the stillness that clung to the air in the house. The walls seemed to echo with it, a weight that pressed on her chest when she tried to breathe too deeply. Her life had unraveled long ago, and now all that remained were these silent hours, each one blending into the next, like the steady drip of water from a leaking roof. Her cottage was small, modest, but it had once been full of life. She could almost hear the laughter of a child, a sound that had been silenced too many years ago. The shelves, once full of books and trinkets, now stood empty, except for the dust that had settled in the corners. Miriam had long since stopped dusting. What was the point? The fire in the hearth crackled softly, the only source of warmth in the room, its orange glow dancing across the faded furniture. She moved toward it, sitting down by the hearth with the weight of her leg pulling her down, but she didn't mind. The ache was familiar, a part of her she had grown used to. She stared into the fire, the flames leaping and curling as though trying to escape the confines of the hearth, much like the restless thoughts that swirled in her mind. The knock on the door came suddenly, sharp and urgent, breaking through the quiet like a crack of thunder. Miriam's head snapped up, her heart skipping a beat. She didn't expect anyone. No one came to her cottage anymore, not after everything had happened. The town had long since turned its back on her, and she had become little more than a ghost, moving through the days without truly living. But this knock, insistent and steady, stirred something in her chest, something that hadn't been stirred in a long time. She rose slowly, wincing as her leg protested the movement. The wind howled louder as she approached the door, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She knew, deep down, that this knock was the turning point. Something was about to change, but she wasn't sure if it was for better or worse. Still, she reached for the door handle, her fingers cold against the brass. With a creak, the door swung open. The man standing on her doorstep was soaked to the bone, water dripping from his coat and pooling at his feet. His face was pale, drawn, and tired, someone who had seen more than his share of hardship. His eyes, however, told a different story. There was something in them, something worn and desperate. In his arms he cradled a tiny, crying infant wrapped in a patchwork quilt. The baby's cries were sharp, raw, cutting through the rain like a knife. Miriam's breath caught in her throat. The man's voice was strained, hoarse, as he spoke. "He ain't yours, but he needs you." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and Miriam felt them settle deep in her chest, like a weight she couldn't shake off. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The storm raged around them, but inside Miriam's cottage there was a strange stillness. The man didn't move, his gaze fixed on the ground as though waiting for something. The baby's cries filled the silence, desperate and helpless, and Miriam found herself stepping aside without thinking, her hand reaching for the child. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. There was something in the man's eyes, something in the baby's cries, that told her everything she needed to know. This was not a request. It was a plea. And it was a plea that she couldn't turn away from no matter how much her heart wanted to. The man stepped into the warmth of the cottage, and Miriam closed the door behind him, her eyes lingering on the small bundle in her arms. The baby's cries quieted as she cradled him, his tiny body warm against her chest. She could feel his heartbeat, steady and strong, and for a moment, she allowed herself to breathe in the weight of this new responsibility, this new life that had unexpectedly entered her world. Elias Boone, the man who had knocked on her door in the rain, stood silently by the hearth, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion. He didn't look at her, didn't say anything more. His eyes were lost, distant, as though the weight of the world had crushed him. Miriam didn't know his story, but she didn't need to. The baby, small and fragile, had a story of his own none that had yet to be written. And Miriam Hart, who had long since given up on her own story, knew that in that moment she had been given the chance to rewrite someone else's. As Elias stepped across the threshold, his boots heavy on the worn wood floor, Miriam felt the weight of the moment settle around her like a cloak. The door clicked shut behind him, and the storm outside seemed to fade into a distant hum. His eyes, still fixed on the floor, didn't meet hers, but Miriam could feel the quiet desperation in his presence. He was a man worn thin by grief, carrying a burden too heavy for one person to bear. And yet, here he stood in her cottage, a stranger, but not quite. Her home, once filled with the warmth of shared meals and laughter, had long since become a sanctuary of silence. The walls, now draped in shadows, seemed to sigh under the weight of memories Miriam would never forget. The small cottage had always been a place where life flowed, where the hum of daily routines had created a rhythm, a pulse. Now it was a place for the weary, for those who had nowhere else to go. She had built it for a future she never quite got to live. Miriam hesitated, standing in the doorway of the small room, the baby cradled carefully in her arms. The weight of him was oddly grounding, and yet it left her uncertain. She had not held a child in years. The last time she had, it had been for a different reason, a different kind of care, a different kind of love. This child, this little soul that now rested against her, was a reminder of all that she had lost, but also of something she had not expected to find. The quiet between her and Elias stretched out, uncomfortable and thick. She didn't know what to say, didn't know how to break the fragile silence that seemed to hang between them. He was a stranger, but not in the way most strangers were. There was a familiarity in his pain, a rawness that spoke to her more deeply than she would have ever imagined. She could see it in his eyes, in the way his shoulders hunched slightly under the weight of the child. He was asking for something he could not give, something Miriam could not offer with words alone. He cleared his throat, and she watched him shift uneasily. When he spoke, his voice was ragged, carrying the weight of grief that had long since sunk into his bones. "My wife, she died," he began, his voice faltering slightly. It was sudden, bleeding. She couldn't stop it. "I thought I could handle it, thought I could do it on my own. But I waited too long. By the time I tried to get help, it was too late. And now, this boy." His voice trailed off as his gaze fell to the child in Miriam's arms. Miriam stood still, absorbing his words. She didn't need to ask for more details. His pain was in the way he spoke, in the way he avoided meeting her gaze. It was the same kind of pain she had known all too well, the kind that came with silence, with regrets that never fully healed. She did not judge him, she could never judge him. Miriam had been the town's pariah once before, branded for sins that were not her own. The town had whispered behind her back, had cast her aside like a ragged doll that no longer held any value. Her kindness, her quiet acts of help and care, had been forgotten by most. The wrongs of others had been placed squarely on her shoulders, and no matter how much she tried to push them off, they clung to her like shadows. Now, as she stood there with this baby in her arms, she wondered if she had the strength to take on yet another responsibility, if she could open her heart to someone she had no connection to, someone who was not her own. She had spent so many years closing herself off from the world that the idea of opening up again felt like a foreign concept. But something inside her stirred, something old and buried deep. She felt it the moment she touched the baby, his warmth, his vulnerability, and she knew that she couldn't turn away. This moment, this child, had the power to change everything. Whether she was ready for it or not, it was already shifting the course of her life. She glanced down at the child in her arms, his tiny face scrunched in sleep, his small chest rising and falling with the rhythm of life. Elias's words echoed in her mind. He ain't yours, but he needs you. It wasn't an invitation. It wasn't a plea. It was a simple truth. The baby needed her. The man, too, needed something from her, though he didn't quite know how to ask for it. Miriam didn't know what the future would hold, but she knew that this was a moment she could not ignore. She stepped closer to the fire, her steps slow but steady, as if each movement carried more weight than it should. She placed the child carefully in the cradle by the hearth, her hands lingering on him for just a moment longer than necessary. Elias, standing just a few feet away, shifted awkwardly, still unsure of what to do next. She could see the questions in his eyes, questions he hadn't yet asked, but questions that would come later, when the storm had passed, when the quiet of her cottage wasn't so oppressive. But for now, Miriam didn't have answers. She only had the baby, his soft breaths filling the silence. She only had the faint, flickering warmth of the fire, the light that would see them through the long night ahead. And for the first time in a long time, she felt a quiet stirring of something she had almost forgotten, a sense of purpose. The kettle sang its quiet tune, a soft whistle that broke the silence between Miriam and Elias. The steam curled upward in slow spirals, filling the small room with the earthy scent of nettle tea. Miriam's hands moved with practiced ease, the motion so natural it was as though she had never stopped, though the years had certainly left their mark on her. She poured the hot tea into a chipped cup, the liquid warm and comforting. There was something grounding in the simple act of preparing tea, something that reminded her of a time when she had been a part of the world, not set apart from it. The sound of the rain continued to batter the cottage, but here, in the flickering glow of the firelight, the world outside felt distant, almost irrelevant. The baby stirred in her arms, his tiny face still contorted with hunger. Miriam shifted him gently, feeling his soft weight against her chest, his small hands reaching instinctively for the warmth she offered. It had been years since she had held a child this small, the weight of him both foreign and familiar. Her own hands, weathered by time, moved with a grace that only came with repetition. She had been a mother once, though not in the way she had imagined, and now, here was this child, so vulnerable, so full of need, and somehow, he had found his way to her. Elias stood nearby, his posture stiff and uncertain, his eyes never quite meeting hers. He shifted from foot to foot, unsure of his place in this quiet scene. He had never expected to find himself here, in a cottage on the outskirts of a town that had long since turned its back on Miriam. He had come to her with nothing, not even a name for the child, and yet she had welcomed him in, had taken the baby without question. And now, as he watched her care for the infant with such ease, such natural tenderness, a deep sense of shame twisted inside him. He didn't belong here, he felt it with every breath he took. Miriam Hart, the woman who had been cast out by the very people she had helped, the woman they called cursed, now the one who held his son, cared for him, as if she were born to do nothing else. He had been wrong about her wrong, about the way the town had talked about her, about the rumors that had followed her wherever she went. It had all been lies, whispered by people too afraid of their own guilt to see her for who she truly was. Elias had believed them, had allowed their hatred to cloud his judgment. But now, in the quiet warmth of her cottage, he saw the truth. Miriam Hart was not the monster they had made her out to be. She was a woman with a heart capable of mercy, of giving what little she had left to a stranger and his child. Miriam didn't speak of the past, and Elias didn't ask. There was no need for words between them, not yet. They both knew that the weight of the past was too heavy to be carried in a single conversation. The silence between them was thick with unspoken understanding, and Miriam allowed it to hang in the air. She didn't need to fill the space with words, not when her actions spoke louder than anything she could say. Her focus remained on the child, the one who needed her care in a way that no one had in a long time. She gently cradled him, lifting the bottle to his lips, and as he latched on, she felt a quiet sense of peace settle over her. There was a strange comfort in this small act of giving, in knowing that she could offer something that mattered, something that made a difference, even if only for this moment. The child's small body relaxed as he drank, his cries slowly fading into contented sighs. Elias watched her, his eyes filled with silent gratitude. He didn't know how to thank her for what she had done, for the way she had taken them both in, without hesitation, without a second thought. Miriam had given him the one thing he hadn't dared hope for: a safe place, a place where the weight of his mistakes could be momentarily set aside. The guilt of his wife's death, the regret of his failures, all seemed to fade for a moment as he watched Miriam care for the child with such quiet devotion. He had never imagined that he would find solace in the arms of a woman like Hearthwoman the town had cast aside, the one they had abandoned. And yet, here he was, standing in her humble cottage, silently indebted to her kindness. Miriam didn't look at him, but she didn't need to. She knew he was there, knew he was watching her, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't mind. She had given up on the idea of ever being seen by the world again, had resigned herself to the shadows where she could hide from the whispers and the judgments. But here, with Elias and the baby, she didn't feel the need to hide. She felt something stir inside her, something small, something fragile, but undeniably real. The storm outside raged on, but inside the cottage, there was a fragile peace. Elias, still unsure of where he fit in this quiet world Miriam had created, slowly approached the fire, his hands resting by his sides as he watched her. He had nothing to offer her in return for her kindness, no wealth, no promises, only the weight of his own brokenness. And yet, she didn't ask for anything in return. She simply gave, as she always had, with no expectation other than the quiet hope that it might be enough. Miriam moved to sit by the hearth, the baby cradled carefully in her arms, his tiny hand curled around her finger. She didn't speak, but Elias could see the quiet strength in her, the way she held herself with a grace that came not from pride, but from survival. She wasn't the woman the town had painted her to be. She was more than that, and Elias, standing silently by the fire, began to understand that. He didn't know what the future would hold for them, but in this moment, in the warmth of the fire and the quiet of the storm, he felt something shift. Something that felt like mercy, something that felt like the first taste of grace he had tasted in years. Miriam placed the baby gently in the cradle, his small body curled into the soft folds of the blanket. She lingered for a moment, watching him as his chest rose and fell with the slow rhythm of sleep, his tiny face softened by the warmth of the firelight. The storm outside raged on, the wind howling and the rain slashing against the windows, but inside her cottage, there was a quiet stillness, an almost sacred peace that seemed to settle into the very bones of the house. It was a peace that Miriam had not known for a long time, but one she now clung to, despite the unspoken weight of the responsibility she had just taken on. Her heart felt heavy, the burden of this new life pressing against her chest, but it wasn't a burden she regretted. The child needed her, and in this moment, that was enough. She had spent years living in the shadows of a past that the town would never forget, a past filled with whispers and judgment. But in this small, humble space, she could create something different for the child, a place of warmth, of care. The weight of the world outside, the accusations and the cold stares, had no place in this room. As she stood over the cradle, Miriam's eyes flicked to the doorway where Elias stood, his posture rigid, his gaze fixed on the flames. He had been so quiet since the baby had arrived, his presence almost as still as the storm that raged outside. His hands were clenched at his sides, his shoulders hunched, as though he were carrying the weight of something too heavy to bear. She could see it in him, the conflict that churned just beneath the surface: gratitude, yes, but also guilt, regret, and a sorrow too deep to articulate. His heart was broken, and Miriam could see that he didn't know how to fit himself into this quiet world that she had created for the child. Miriam said nothing, knowing that the silence between them was not to be disturbed. Some things couldn't be spoken aloud, and some burdens were too raw to share. Elias had come to her with nothing, no name for the child, no answers, just a desperate plea. And she had taken them in without question, without hesitation, knowing that the only thing that mattered was giving this child a place where he could sleep soundly, without fear, without want. She watched him for a moment longer, his face cast in the shadows of the firelight, the lines of his jaw tense with the weight of the guilt he carried. He didn't speak, and Miriam didn't ask him to. She knew that the words would come when he was ready, when the weight of his own brokenness had eased enough for him to breathe. Until then, there was nothing she could offer him but her quiet presence, the steady rhythm of life that hummed in the background of their shared silence. The storm outside battered against the walls, the wind pushing at the windows as if trying to force its way inside. But within the confines of the cottage, the world seemed far away. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and the baby's steady breathing was the only sound that filled the space between them. Miriam settled into her chair, her gaze never leaving Elias. The tension in his posture remained, but there was something in the way he stood, something that had shifted, something that told her he wasn't entirely lost. Not yet. Elias slowly lowered himself to a chair by the fire, his eyes flicking to the cradle where the baby slept. For a long time, neither of them spoke. There was no need to. The child, wrapped in the warmth of the room, had already begun to heal something within them. And in the stillness, Miriam realized that the child wasn't the only one who had found solace in the peace of this cottage. She didn't know how to fix Elias, or to heal the wounds he carried, but she could offer him this quiet, unspoken, and steady. Just as the baby had found comfort in the steady rhythm of Miriam's hands, Elias, too, could find peace in the silence between them. There was no need for words, no need for apologies or explanations. In this moment, the unspoken bond between them was enough. The storm outside was relentless, but it no longer seemed to matter. Inside, there was a quiet strength, a shared understanding that had no need for words. Miriam sat by the fire, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the worn edge of her shawl, the flickering light casting long shadows across the room. The baby slept, the steady rise and fall of his chest, a rhythm that seemed to slow the world around them. Elias finally exhaled a long breath, his shoulders sagging slightly as if a part of the burden he carried had been released into the silence of the room. He still didn't speak, but Miriam could feel the change in him, the faint release of tension, the softening of the guilt that had weighed so heavily on him. For now, this was enough. The child, the fire, the quiet rhythm of life, they were all they needed. The town may never accept Miriam, and Elias may never fully rid himself of the weight of his past, but here, in this small cottage, there was a place where mercy could breathe, where the quiet bond between them could flourish, unseen by the world but strong enough to carry them both through whatever storms might come next. And as the night stretched on, Miriam allowed herself a moment of peace, knowing that, for the first time in a long while, she was not alone. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room. Miriam sat by the warmth, her eyes not on the flames but on the stillness that filled the space between her and Elias. He was across from her, his elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped together, and his gaze fixed somewhere in the distance. The silence between them stretched long, stretching farther than the distance between two people simply sharing a room. It was a silence, thick with unspoken words, filled with the weight of things neither of them had yet voiced. Elias didn't ask her question, she didn't have to. He had learned, perhaps too late, that silence often spoke louder than any words could. There were regrets written in the lines of his face, in the way his shoulders slumped under the weight of a past he could never change. Miriam could see it in the way he sat, hunched slightly, as if the burden of his own mistakes was too heavy to lift. His hands fidgeted, as if they were unsure what to do with the guilt that clung to them. She didn't need him to speak. The sorrow was clear in his stillness, in the tension that radiated from him like heat from the fire. Miriam knew the weight of old wounds better than most. Her own life had been filled with whispers, quiet murmurs that followed her from room to room, from house to house, and from person to person. Whispers about her past mistakes, about things she had done, and things she had been blamed for. She had spent so many years trying to repair the damage done to her reputation, only to find that no matter how much good she had done in the world, no one could ever look beyond the mistakes. She had cared for the sick, nursed them through fever and pain, offered her hands to heal when the town's physicians had their backs turned. She had helped where others had ignored, provided for those no one else would. But none of that mattered when the town turned its back on her. None of the kindness, none of the hours spent mending broken bodies or souls had ever been enough to erase the stain they had put on her. They had turned on her, just as they had turned on the woman who raised this child, the woman whose name would forever be linked to shame. In the end, it was easier to forget the good and focus on the wrongs. It was easier to whisper behind closed doors than to admit that the truth was far more complicated than the stories they told. Elias shifted in his chair, breaking the stillness. His voice, when it came, was hoarse, tinged with exhaustion, as if the words were too heavy to carry. "My wife, she's gone," he began, his eyes still trained on the fire, but his voice hollow with the weight of the admission. "She died. It was sudden. Blood wouldn't stop and I couldn't." He stopped himself, as if the words were too raw to continue. He rubbed his face, the exhaustion in his hands, his body settling into his posture. "I didn't want to ask for help," he continued, his voice softer now. "I thought I could handle it. I didn't want anyone to see me fail, didn't want anyone to see me as weak. But she—" His voice cracked slightly, and he let out a shaky breath. "She died in my arms, and I failed her." Miriam didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence was a quiet offering, an open invitation for him to continue if he needed to, or to stop if the words became too much. She had learned over the years that sometimes people didn't need answers, they just needed someone to hear them. She could feel the tension in Elias's shoulders as he exhaled deeply, the weight of his failure settling over him again. He wasn't looking for absolution. He wasn't asking for her forgiveness. He was simply stating the facts of a life that had been irrevocably altered. And in his words, Miriam recognized a shared experience, a deep, painful knowing that she had felt herself. "I didn't even try to get help," Elias continued, his voice growing more distant, like he was telling the story to someone else, not to the woman sitting in front of him. "I thought I could fix it on my own, but I was too late. I couldn't stop it. I couldn't save her. And now—" He trailed off again, his throat thick with emotion. Miriam didn't interrupt. She let the silence stretch, let him process, let him sit with the weight of what he had said. She understood. She understood what it felt like to carry guilt that weighed so heavy it threatened to pull you under. She understood what it felt like to wish you could go back and do things differently, to wish you had acted sooner or said something sooner, but knowing deep down that time had already slipped away. She had known that kind of regret all too well. The fire crackled in the hearth, but the silence between them felt more potent than the flames. Miriam glanced at Elias, and for a moment, her gaze softened. She saw the brokenness in him, the rawness of a man who had tried to carry too much alone. She wanted to tell him that it wasn't too late to change, that there was still time to make things right. But she didn't, because she knew he wasn't ready to hear it yet. Instead, she simply nodded, acknowledging the weight of his words. And for a moment, just a fleeting moment, they were both able to sit together in that silence, bound by the shared understanding of loss, of mistakes, and the quiet yearning for something more than what they had been handed. There were no answers between them, no quick fixes to the pain that each of them carried. But for the first time in a long time, the silence wasn't heavy with judgment. It was heavy with understanding, and that, Miriam thought, was the first step toward healing. The wind had begun to calm by the time Elias and Miriam sat in the dim light of the fire, the storm outside losing its fury, becoming little more than a whisper in the night. The rain had softened to a steady drizzle, the kind that lingered in the air, leaving everything drenched but not fully washed clean. Inside, the warmth of the fire was the only thing that kept the chill at bay, and the silence that filled the room was both peaceful and suffocating, as though the weight of everything unspoken between them hung thick in the air. Elias hadn't moved much since they had spoken earlier, his eyes still fixed on the fire, his face drawn with exhaustion. Miriam sat across from him, her gaze shifting from the flickering flames to the baby, now asleep in the cradle, his tiny hands curled into soft fists. The child, still nameless, slept soundly, his peacefulness, a sharp contrast to the turmoil that had brought him here. Elias shifted in his seat, his voice breaking the quiet. "I don't know what to call him," he said, his words slow and uncertain, like the weight of them had to be worked out before they could be spoken aloud. "I've got no right to give him a name, not after everything that's happened." He ran a hand over his face, his fingers trembling slightly as they brushed against the stubble on his jaw. "I don't even know who he really is. What right do I have to claim him?" Miriam glanced at him, her eyes soft with understanding. She knew the depth of his hesitation, the guilt that twisted inside him like a knot he couldn't untangle. He was a man broken by his own choices, his own failures, and now he stood at a threshold he didn't know how to cross. A name was more than just a word, it was an identity, a claim to a future, to something that could be loved and cared for. But Elias wasn't ready to give that to the child, wasn't ready to claim him as his own. Miriam had spent so many years living without a name of her own, without the luxury of being seen as more than the mistakes others had attached to her. She understood what it felt like to be nameless, to have your very identity stripped away by those who judged you. She knew that names weren't just about blood, they were about the care you gave, the love you offered, and the responsibility you took. They were about the small, quiet acts that spoke louder than any title ever could. "You don't need a blood tie to give someone a name," Miriam said softly, her voice calm but sure. She looked at the baby, her gaze lingering for a moment before meeting Elias's eyes. "It's not about who he was born to, Elias. It's about who's willing to take responsibility for him, who's willing to care for him, to love him." She paused, her hands resting in her lap, the weight of her words sinking in between them. "A name is a promise, not a birthright. It's the love you give, the care you show. That's what makes a name worth something." Elias was quiet, his gaze still locked on the fire, but his brow furrowed as if Miriam's words were slowly working their way through the fog of guilt and confusion that clouded his mind. He had never seen it that way. He had always believed that a name was something that tied you to something bigger, something you couldn't escape, something you had to carry forever. He had always felt disconnected from his own name, a legacy he couldn't live up to. And now, with the child before him, he wasn't sure if he could bear the weight of giving a name that would tie him to something so fragile, something he didn't feel he could protect. But Miriam's words had a quiet power. She wasn't telling him that he had to give the child a name to make it official. She was telling him that the act of giving was what mattered, that a name was an offering of responsibility, of care. He didn't have to be perfect to claim this child, to step into the role of protector. He just had to show up, to be there, to offer whatever part of himself he had left to give. The night stretched on, the fire burning low as the rain outside faded into a soft patter. Elias remained silent for a while, his fingers tapping nervously against his knee. The baby stirred in the cradle, but Miriam gently rocked it back into a peaceful sleep. She could see the conflict still etched into Elias's face, the war between guilt and hope, the weight of a past he couldn't undo and the fragile possibility of redemption that lay before him. There was no certainty in the future, no clear path forward, but in that moment, They shared something deeper than words could convey. Finally, Elias spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what I'm doing," he admitted, the vulnerability in his words raw and honest. "But I'll stay." He looked at Miriam then, his eyes finally meeting hers with a quiet resolve. "I don't have much to offer, but I'll stay. For him. For both of you." Miriam didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She simply nodded, her heart softening in the way it always did when the storm inside someone else calmed enough for them to make a choice. Elias didn't need to be perfect. He didn't need to have all the answers. All he needed was the willingness to stay, to give what he could, however small it seemed. And so, in the quiet of the night, in the space between the two of them, something shifted. There was no grand declaration of love, no promises made about what the future would hold, but there was an understanding, a bond that had formed not out of blood or history, but out of need. Out of the simple decision to be there for someone who needed it. For now, that was enough. The storm had passed, but in the stillness of Miriam's cottage, they found something that could last longer than any storm. A quiet commitment to each other, to the child who had unknowingly brought them together. And with that, Elias finally made a quiet, resolute decision to stay. The morning was cold, the air thick with the remnants of the storm. The sky had cleared, but the ground was still wet, the damp earth rising in soft tendrils of mist. Elias and Miriam stepped out of the cottage, the first light of dawn casting long shadows on the path before them. In Miriam's arms, wrapped in the shawl she had sewn herself, was the baby still sleeping, his tiny face pressed against her chest, safe and warm. She felt the weight of him there, an anchor in her world that had long been adrift. The stillness of the morning felt like a brief respite, a fleeting moment before the world would resume its judgment. Miriam had long grown used to the eyes that followed her, the whispers that always seemed to rise when she walked through town, the silent condemnation that came with every step. But this morning, for the first time in years, something inside her shifted. The weight of their judgment didn't settle on her shoulders like it used to. She didn't flinch when she heard the murmurs behind her. She didn't shrink away from the stares that pierced her back. Today, she walked with purpose, her head held high, her shoulders straight, the baby nestled in her arms. Elias walked beside her, his presence a quiet reassurance, though he, too, was aware of the eyes on them. He had always been the man in the background, a man who had learned to avoid the gaze of others, to keep his head down and his heart closed. But now, as he walked with Miriam, he could feel the weight of the town's judgment pressing in on them both. The quiet whispers followed them like an unseen wind, tugging at their clothing, at their very souls. Still, he didn't let it show. He matched her pace, stepping beside her without hesitation, as if this was where he was meant to be, in this moment, with her and the child. They made their way to the well, the familiar sound of the water sloshing against the sides of the bucket ringing in the air. Miriam reached for the rope, her hands steady as she pulled up the water, the cool splash against the wood a small comfort in the face of everything that surrounded them. As she worked, she could feel the gaze of someone on her. A woman from the prayer group, standing on her porch, her eyes narrow and lips tight, watching them with judgment in her gaze. Miriam knew her, knew the whispers that had always followed her, the rumors that had been spoken behind closed doors, the way the woman had looked at her with cold eyes when she had passed her in the street. Miriam had never been part of that group, never been welcomed into their fold. She had never been good enough for them, never fit into the neat, tidy lives they lived. But she wasn't looking for their approval anymore. Not today. Today she stood tall, and if they wanted to whisper, if they wanted to judge her, they would have to do it from a distance. She had no more room in her heart for their condemnation. As they filled the bucket, Miriam's fingers brushed against the cold metal handle, and she felt a surge of something fierce, something that had been buried deep within her for so long. She didn't care what they thought anymore. She didn't care about the judgment, the whispers, the glares. She had the baby, and she had Elias. That was enough. It was more than enough. The woman on the porch didn't say a word. Her lips remained tight, her gaze still fixed on Miriam, but Miriam didn't flinch. She met the woman's eyes for a moment, steady and unwavering, before turning away to head back down the path toward the cottage. Elias followed her, his stride matching hers, steady and sure. He didn't need to speak either. He didn't need to say anything to Miriam because the unspoken understanding between them was enough. He had been where she had, felt the weight of being unwanted, the sting of being cast aside. But now, standing beside her, he knew they could face whatever the world had to throw at them. Together. As they walked back toward the cottage, the whispers still hung in the air, but they no longer felt heavy. The town might never accept her, might never see her for who she truly was, but Miriam didn't need them to. She didn't need their approval. She had already carved out a place for herself, a space where she could be something more than the woman they had cast aside. And in this small corner of the world, with Elias and the baby by her side, she had found a new kind of peace. The storm outside had passed, but the storm within her had begun to settle, too. And with each step she took, Miriam realized that the world's whispers would never touch her in the same way again. She had learned at last how to stand in the face of judgment, to walk forward with her head held high, to let the weight of her own choices and actions speak louder than the voices that tried to tear her down. Today, the town could whisper all they wanted, but Miriam knew that she had already won. She had found her place, and nothing they could say would ever take that from her. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with soft hues of orange and purple, the evening air grew cooler, carrying the scent of damp earth and the lingering remnants of the storm. Inside Miriam's cottage, the warmth from the hearth bathed the room in a golden glow, its flickering light casting long shadows against the walls. The baby slept peacefully in the cradle, his steady breathing the only sound breaking the stillness of the room. Elias had gone out to tend to the garden, and Miriam, for a brief moment, allowed herself to settle into the quiet, the solitude she had come to know so well. But then, as if the night itself had called her back to reality, a knock came at the door, a firm, insistent knock, echoing through the silence. Miriam's stomach tightened, her muscles tensing instinctively. She didn't need to ask who it was. She already knew. It was Mrs. Evelyn Pike, the elder from the church, who had long since made her opinion of Miriam known. Miriam rose from her chair, her fingers brushing against the edge of the table for balance as she walked toward the door. She didn't hesitate. She knew what was coming. Evelyn was no stranger to this kind of visit, the kind where she would show up, her face tight with disapproval, her words wrapped in the guise of concern, but always meant to remind Miriam of her place in the town. She had come to Miriam before, back when the whispers about her reputation were still fresh, when the weight of the past was still pressing down on her shoulders. With a deep breath, Miriam opened the door. Standing on the threshold was Evelyn, her posture rigid, her expression stern as always. She was dressed in her usual black dress, the material heavy with the weight of unspoken judgments, her eyes scanning the small cottage behind Miriam as if it didn't belong to someone like her. "Miriam," Evelyn greeted her, the words stiff, a thinly veiled attempt at politeness. "I trust you're well." Her gaze flicked down to the bundle in Miriam's arms before returning to her face, cold and calculating. Miriam stepped aside, allowing Evelyn to enter, her movements calm but firm. She didn't invite her, and Evelyn knew better than to expect that kind of warmth from her, but she didn't slam the door either. The silence that followed Evelyn's arrival was heavy, filled with the weight of years of disapproval, years of standing on the outside of this woman's rigid sense of right and wrong. "I'm sure you know why I'm here," Evelyn said, her voice sharp but controlled. She didn't wait for a response, her eyes locking with Miriam's in a way that spoke more of superiority than concern. "This child," she paused, her lips pressing together in distaste, "should not be raised in this house. It's no place for him. You've already given the town enough to talk about, but this is beyond what even I can turn a blind eye to." Miriam's jaw tightened, But she didn't flinch. She had heard these words before, over and over again, each one a reminder of how she would never be good enough in the eyes of people like Evelyn. She had spent so many years shrinking beneath the weight of other people's judgments, bending to their will in hopes of gaining their approval, but no longer. She had nothing to prove to this woman, nothing to explain. Miriam, Evelyn continued, I've spoken to the others, and they agree. The child would be better off with a respectable family, someone who can offer him a proper upbringing. He deserves more than what you can give him, and if you truly care about him, you'll see that. The words were meant to wound, meant to tear at the very foundation of the life Miriam had started to build, but they didn't have the power they once did. Miriam's grip on the baby tightened ever so slightly, a quiet reaffirmation of the promise she had made to herself the moment the child had entered her life. She took a step closer to Evelyn, her posture unyielding. The truth is, Evelyn, she said, her voice calm but unwavering, I've already done more for this child than anyone else in this town ever will. I've given him something you and your respectable families could never give him, a place where he is safe, where he is loved. And I will continue to do so, no matter what you or anyone else thinks. For a moment, there was only silence. Evelyn's mouth pressed into a thin line, her eyes flashing with a mixture of shock and indignation. She had expected Miriam to cower, to offer some kind of apology, to beg for forgiveness. But Miriam had no apologies left to give. She had stopped asking for forgiveness a long time ago. I know you don't understand, Miriam continued, her voice quieter now but filled with an undeniable strength. But that doesn't matter. What matters is that this child is here, and I will do whatever it takes to give him a chance, something more than the whispers of this town, more than the judgments you hold against me. Evelyn opened her mouth, but no words came out. For the first time in their history of encounters, she was speechless. The quiet that hung between them was thick with the unspoken truth that Miriam had finally come into her own, that she no longer cared about the approval of a town that had never once truly seen her. She wasn't the woman they had painted her to be. She wasn't the woman they could discard with a few whispered words. She was something else, a woman who had found her strength, a woman who had a purpose. Miriam held Evelyn's gaze for a long moment before turning toward the door. I think you should leave now, Evelyn, she said, her tone final, unyielding. And don't come back. For a long moment, Evelyn stood frozen, her mouth slightly open, as if waiting for Miriam to retract her words. But Miriam said nothing more. She simply watched as Evelyn turned, her footsteps echoing in the small cottage as she left, the door closing softly behind her. As the silence settled once again, Miriam let out a slow breath, her shoulders relaxing for the first time since Evelyn had arrived. The storm outside may have passed, but the battle had just begun. And this time, Miriam was ready to face it on her own terms. The fire crackled in the hearth, sending warm tendrils of light dancing across the walls, its glow a quiet companion to the stillness that filled the room. Elias and Miriam sat side by side, the baby nestled between them, wrapped in the warmth of the fire's embrace. The storm that had raged outside for so long had finally passed, leaving behind only the soft patter of rain against the roof and the distant hum of the night air. The storm, like the tensions that had filled the space between them for so long, was gone, but the silence that followed it seemed heavier than ever. They didn't speak of the visit from Evelyn Pike. Neither of them had to. The unspoken words hung between them like a fragile thread, a pact they both understood without needing to voice it. Miriam knew what Evelyn had said, and she knew the judgment the town would continue to cast upon her. But she also knew that those words, those whispers, no longer held the same weight they once had. The town could talk all it wanted, could look on with disdain and whisper about her every move, but Miriam had long ago learned that none of that mattered. What mattered now was the child between them, the quiet bond that had formed in the space of a few short weeks, and the understanding that they had, perhaps for the first time, found something in each other that neither of them had expected. Elias didn't speak either. He sat still, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze drifting to the baby between them. The child slept peacefully, the small rise and fall of his chest, the only sound in the room. Elias, like Miriam, had seen his share of judgment, and the quiet disapproval from the world had settled into him like a weight he carried on his shoulders. But here, in this small cottage, that weight felt a little lighter. He wasn't sure what to call the bond between them, whether it was companionship, understanding, or something else entirely, but he knew it was real. He had come to Miriam with nothing, no hope, no plan, and she had offered him a place, not out of pity, but out of something else. Something that felt like kindness, something that felt like it was given freely, without expectation. Without a word, Elias stood and walked to the door. Miriam watched him, her gaze steady. She didn't ask where he was going. She didn't need to. She had learned that silence could say more than words ever could. She could feel the tension in him, the need to do something, to fix something. He didn't have to explain. She understood. He was a man who had spent too much of his life trying to repair what was broken in himself, trying to make amends for a past that wasn't his fault but still weighed heavily on his conscience. Outside, the night air was cool, the rain having left a faint smell of damp earth and fresh wood. Elias stood on the porch, his eyes scanning the small yard in front of the cottage. The broken step caught his eye, and without thinking, he bent down, his hands working to fix it. The movements were deliberate, slow, each motion filled with a quiet purpose. Miriam watched him from the window, her eyes softening as she saw him kneel to repair the step. It wasn't just the wood he was fixing. He was fixing something in himself, something he didn't know how to name. Miriam didn't ask him to stay. She didn't need to. The truth was, she had already found something in him. She hadn't expected a quiet kind of companionship. It wasn't grand or bold. It didn't come with promises of forever or declarations of loyalty. But it was there, in the way he moved around her cottage, in the way he cared for the child without asking for anything in return, in the way he silently acknowledged the quiet bond they had formed. She didn't need his words to know that he would stay, at least for now. She didn't need him to say anything to her. What they shared was simple and unspoken, and that was enough. As Elias worked, Miriam leaned back in her chair, her eyes drifting to the baby in the cradle. She had known loneliness, known what it was like to carry the weight of the world on her own shoulders. But now, with Elias and the child, there was a sense of quiet peace that had been absent for so long. The town could never accept them, she knew that. They would never be the picture of respectability that the town demanded. But she didn't care anymore. She didn't need their acceptance. Not when she had found something that felt more real, more important, than any approval the town could offer. Elias finished repairing the step, and as he stood up, he wiped his hands on his trousers, dusting off the sawdust that had gathered there. He didn't look at Miriam, but she could feel the shift in him. He had repaired the step, yes, but he had also repaired something inside himself, something that had been broken for a long time. They didn't need to speak about it. Neither of them needed to explain. The understanding between them was enough. As Elias stepped back inside, he didn't say anything. He simply sat down beside her again, his body closer to hers than it had been before. The silence between them was comfortable now, no longer filled with tension or unspoken fears. It was the kind of silence that comes when two people know, without a doubt, that they are not alone anymore. The fire crackled softly, and the night pressed in around them. Outside, the storm had passed, but inside, they were no longer just surviving. They were finding something in each other that neither had expected, and that, in its own quiet way, was all they needed to face whatever came next. The fire burned low in the hearth, the orange glow casting gentle shadows across the room. Miriam sat by its warmth, her gaze fixed on the child asleep in the cradle. His soft breathing filled the silence of the cottage, a rhythm that anchored the room, steady and calm. Elias sat across from her, his legs stretched out in front of him, his hands resting loosely in his lap. He didn't speak, nor did Miriam. The weight of their shared silence was not uncomfortable, nor was it heavy. It was simply there, a quiet understanding that lingered between them. They had not spoken of the future. There had been no grand declarations, no promises made, there was no need for them. They both knew that the path ahead was uncertain, unknown in ways they couldn't predict. But, for the first time in a long time, Miriam didn't feel the need to worry about it. She didn't feel the pressing weight of the decisions yet to come, or the fear that used to cling to her every move. In this moment, there was a strange, unspoken peace between them, as though the very air had quieted in the presence of something fragile, something worth protecting. Miriam had spent so many years living in the shadows of others, always choosing what was best for someone else, always sacrificing her own desires, her own needs, for the sake of those around her. She had given and given, hoping that the love she offered would be enough to fill the empty spaces in her life, but it never had been. The whispers from the town, the judgments, the way they had turned their backs on her when she had needed them most, she had carried it all silently, bearing the weight of their expectations and their disdain. But now, for the first time, she had made a choice for herself. The decision had come slowly, with no fanfare, no rush. It had been made in the quiet moments, in the spaces between the noise of the world, where she had realized that what mattered most was not the approval of others, but the warmth in her own heart. The choice wasn't just for the child, though she had taken him in with a fierce determination to protect him. It was also for herself, for the woman who had been cast aside for too long, for the woman who had been told she didn't matter. Miriam had chosen this path, chosen to step into the light, however dim it was, and to embrace the responsibility of caring for a child who had no one else. The baby stirred slightly in his sleep, his tiny hands curling and uncurling, as if in some dream only he could understand. Miriam's heart fluttered at the sight, her fingers brushing the edge of the cradle as if to reassure herself that this was real, that she hadn't imagined it. The child was hers now, in a way that felt more profound than any legal document could express. She had made this choice without thinking of what the town might say, without worrying about the judgments that would come. She had chosen him. Elias shifted slightly, his eyes moving from the child to Miriam, his face soft in the firelight. He had been quiet since they had settled in for the night, and Miriam wondered what was going through his mind. He had come to her with nothing, had found in her a place of refuge, a quiet peace that was almost foreign to him. Miriam had not expected to find anything like that in him, but she had. In a world that had always told her she was less than, Elias had offered her the one thing that had eluded her for years, a sense of being seen, of being understood. He hadn't asked for anything in return. He had simply stayed. They had not spoken of what came next. It was as if the unspoken understanding between them was enough. They didn't need to talk about what the future held for them, for the child. It was enough to know that they had come to this place together, that the shared bond between them, though quiet and unspoken, was solid, as strong as the walls of the cottage that sheltered them. The world outside still whispered, still carried its judgments and expectations, but in this small cottage, in the flickering warmth of the fire and the soft breathing of the child, there was peace. The past had been heavy, filled with pain and loss, but for now, it had quieted, tucked away in the shadows of the night. And the future, uncertain as it was, seemed distant, something that could wait. Miriam didn't need to know what would happen tomorrow. For the first time in years, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel, a quiet hope. It wasn't the kind of hope that shouted for attention, the kind that demanded change. No, this hope was smaller, quieter, like the first light of dawn creeping across the horizon, soft and steady. It was the hope that came with knowing she had done the right thing, that she had made a choice that was hers to make. Elias shifted again, his eyes meeting hers for a brief moment, and in that exchange, Miriam saw a flicker of the same quiet hope. He didn't need to say anything. His gaze, steady and calm, spoke volumes. The future might be uncertain, but in this small, humble cottage, for this moment, it was enough. And as they sat together, the baby nestled between them, Miriam knew that whatever came next, they would face it together.